Hello everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, because we have lots of audience from different time zones. So yeah, welcome all. Welcome joining us at this webinar, Decarbonization of the Built Environment with CRREM. I'm Dennis Wu, founding president of Greater Bay Area Carbon Neutrality Association. I will be your moderator in this webinar. We're happy to have Professor BIENERT and also KWAN and Ms. Grace Koch today. And first, let me give you a brief initiative of having this webinar. Allied Environmental Consultants Limited, AEC, has partnered with Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, CRREM, to accelerate the net zero transition of real estate sector in the Asia Pacific region. As the GREB's Asia Pacific training partners and the first partners of CRREM in Hong Kong and China, AEC strives to support companies of all sizes in their decarbonization journey using the updated CRREM SBTi aligned pathway. In this first introductory webinar themed Decarbonization of the Built Environment with CRREM, we'll walk you through CRREM-updated in-use decarbonization pathways for energy and carbon. The second one will be the global developments regarding regulations, tools, carbon pricing, frameworks, etc. And the third one will get started how to tailor activities for your company. And the fourth one will be the best practice case studies from industry leaders. At the end of the speaker's presentation, we would like to have a panel discussion and also Q&A session. Feel free to enter your question into the Zoom's chat box, and we will answer your question at the end of the panel discussion. For the time being, let's welcome Professor BIENERT, CRREM Lead and Director Competence Center of Sustainability Real Estate University of Regensburg. He will start with what CRREM is and how CRREM can help you to accelerate the net zero journey. Professor, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your kind introduction, Dennis, and giving me the opportunity to present our resources here. Shall I share my screen? I think that works well, I guess. And I hope you can see my slides now. Is that okay? Yeah, working?
Yes.
So the Carbon Real Estate Risk Monitor was originally developed in Europe, but is now covering in great detail all parts of the world. So also Asia Pacific, Australia, and America, of course. And today, of course, we would like to focus on China and Hong Kong in this respect. What is the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor? We have provided decarbonization pathways, 1.5 degree aligned pathways, which could be applied as a benchmark for your own carbon and energy intensities related to your property stock to make sure you are aligned to a 1.5 degree world. So these pathways are Paris aligned. And to facilitate that process, we have also provided a short or small tool that could be applied, and all the resources are for free and available on our website. For the update, I think I'm focusing a bit on our update as we have just released the revised CRREM pathways. So I think colleagues will show a bit more on the application of our resources, but maybe a bit on the update that we have just concluded. The first version set of pathways was available already 4 or 5 years ago. And of course, the underlying fundamentals regarding energy intensity starting points and different countries, emission factors, the grid decarbonization, that is, of course, one factor affecting or one aspect affecting the decarbonization and pathways until 2050. All these underlying assumptions have changed over time, clearly. So we needed to ensure that they are up to date, and that's why we conducted an update. And you can see here that we have basically run a global consultation now for the update, since CRREM has become quite popular. There was a lot of stakeholder engagement and a lot of feedback. We've received a tremendous amount of input during that consultation phase. So basically, in a nutshell, the revised pathways are now even more bulletproof than before. They are available on our website alongside with the revised methodology document that is also available on our website. What have we basically done? I think it's clear that all sectors, including real estate, need to decarbonize until 2050. All countries have agreed to the so-called Paris Accord, which means that we would like to decarbonize our industries and societies until 2050. That, of course, puts us in the position that we need to have a bulletproof pathway or trajectory also for real estate in operations and related to embodied carbon. And the first step that we do in our downscaling and derivation of the pathways is, of course, allocating a sort of fair share of the overall remaining anthropogenic carbon budget to real estate. And in our case, it's real estate in operations. So our pathways are covering exclusively the in-use phase. We do that because in a lot of countries, more than 70–80% of the existing building stock will still be there in 2050. And of course, it's urgently needed that we decarbonize the footprint, the energy intensities, reduction of these properties, and not just ensure that new properties are decarbonized, which is sort of the aspect of embodied carbon. You see that on the right-hand side, there has been the sort of revised pathway, the first one, and sort of the new pathways, excluding distribution and the transmission losses, which is an aspect that is related to our collaboration with SBTi. SBTi is the most dominant company target setting initiative globally, and we partnered with SBTi to have the joint SBTi CRREM pathways from this version onwards to make sure that there is a harmonized and one set sort of global benchmark available that is aligned to a global standard, but at the same time has high precision in the different countries. And we will also, of course, touch upon China and Hong Kong in a bit more detail, because there are a lot of input parameters, of course, if you want to derive a country and use type specific pathway that need to be gathered within those countries. And in our case, of course, here we did partner with a lot of organizations and data providers in Hong Kong, likewise China, and wanted to, of course, make sure that especially with this update, we have even more precision regarding the starting points and the pathways going forward with regards to China and Hong Kong. Related to the pathways, what are we sort of in a very sort of first glimpse, what are we doing on a very high level perception here? First of all, we need to allocate, of course, as I said before, the CO2 budget to the real estate sector, and in our case, the in-use phase. We have not just looked at the CO2 only pathways that are available on our website, but we have also looked at other greenhouse gases, and of course, related to real estate, especially refrigerants, the so-called F gases are important. In the second step here, it's called B. They have been broken down to a country and then afterwards use type level. Related to the country level, we are always starting with the country average of the residential and commercial real estate sector, and then dive deeper into different use types and reconvert that into carbon intensities at the same time. Of course, the calculation itself is quite complex. You see here this abbreviation SDA, which is the so-called sectoral decarbonization approach. That's an approach that has been developed by the Science Based Targets Initiative, and we have been applying this approach to allocate a fair share of the remaining carbon budget to different countries. You can see here that if you start the net zero journey, this is a graph that has been produced by IPF in the UK, and it basically is or was intended at the end of 2022 to, at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, to provide an overview for market participants. What are initiatives, what are frameworks, what are global targets related to setting net zero targets and accomplishing those targets for the real estate sector. And for sure, you can add many more regional and national initiatives and organizations here, but I think these are already the most prominent ones. And you see in this section where they talk about targets, CRREM and SBTI, and I'm sort of adding here a bit what happened during the last year, because just the middle part is from IPF, and I'm adding here what sort of should be changed. And the most dominant change is, of course, that we partnered, in this case, CRREM with SBTI. So there is, as I said before, just one global target setter for decarbonization pathways. There are a few national organizations that we collaborate with, like the UK Green Building Council. They are setting decarbonization targets for the in-use phase of properties. In the UK, they are aligned with CRREM, but you have no other sort of global standard setter in this respect. And we are, of course, collaborating, as you can see on the left-hand side, with all the other organizations. Regarding the update, what is important, if you look at the revised pathways and our resources, we have partnered with an additional tremendous amount of data partners globally. We have, for instance, in Australia, partnered with the Australian Green Building Council. Jorge Chapas was a great help when we were gathering local market data to calculate the revised pathways. The same in Singapore, the same in Hong Kong, China, and so on. We added a bit more asset classes. As you know, we are not just differentiating between commercial real estate and residential real estate, but we are doing further breakdowns. And for instance, we had before just one industrial distribution pathway, and now we are breaking down in cold and hot storage, which of course is, in terms of the carbon and energy intensities, a great difference. We have been differentiating now the CO2 only pathway and the additional greenhouse gases, which was needed to align with SBTI. If you are familiar with the Science Based Targets Initiative, if you have already submitted your company net zero targets to SBTI, you will probably know that they have sort of the CO2 only pathways that have been checked in the past. And the same will also, of course, happen in the future if you submit your company targets to SBTI. And that's why we needed to split our before greenhouse gas altogether sort of pathway in two parts, which is other greenhouse gases and CO2. With regard to changes, of course, you can imagine that going back 4 or 5 years, the first set of pathways was, of course, looking at the data at that point in time. Now we've moved on, and as you know, the societies as a whole have not been able to align to 1.5 degree already or in the past. That is called overshoot. So the carbon budgets that were suggested in the past to be aligned to 1.5 degree world were surpassed. And this is, of course, going forward, putting even more pressure on the updates of pathway and target setters like us, which means that the revised pathway set is, of course, a bit more ambitious compared to the past. Some other differences, I'm not digging into all details, maybe one significant difference, SBTI has always been looking at emission factors that were excluding transmission and distribution losses, because they see that as emissions that should be related to the energy sector and not the sector that is in question, in our case, real estate. So we aligned to that, which means the revised emission factors in our case are not just lower because decarbonization did progress, which is also another aspect, but they are also lower because the transmission and distribution losses were excluded. You see here sort of the output of the revised pathways, and I think Grace is also showing sort of how you can benchmark your property against these pathways. But in a nutshell, what we do offer is, in this case, you can see it for China and office buildings, energy intensity pathways, which are 1.5 degree aligned, and you can see the CO2, in this case, decarbonization pathways going forward. And the starting point is sort of always the current situation in the respective countries, which means that at the moment, the energy intensities are, of course, quite high in the office sector, for instance, in China, and the carbon intensities likewise, but they need to decarbonize over time. You see also something that has been introduced with the update, which is sort of this flattening out of the energy intensities. And that's the reason for that is we are looking at the available renewable energy budget in 2050 that could be allocated again to the real estate sector. And we are allocating aligned to or taking into account heating and cooling degree days. We allocate a fair share again to the different nations, in our case here, China. And that means that sort of in 2050, properties should run purely, or in this case, offices should run purely on renewable energy, and they should not consume more than 65 or 70 kilowatt hours per square meter. Clear call to look at all these things, not just related to CRREM, of course, but to look at all aspects of transition risk, which means trying to be aligned of what's coming. And you know that regulation has been increasing a lot related to having higher energy efficiency and decarbonizing the different sectors. It's the same in China and Hong Kong, of course. Likewise, we saw developments all over the globe, and you see here the projections of the carbon price, which is, of course, expected to increase significantly. We have in Europe, for instance, come from a carbon price 4 or 5 years ago that was trading around 6, 7, 8 euros per ton CO2 emissions. Now we are looking already at a carbon price beyond $100 per ton. And if these carbon prices are then transformed by politicians and regulators into carbon tax, into carbon trading system, then this has, of course, a significant financial impact on real estate as well. And we see that all over the globe. So really looking at decarbonization, making sure your properties are aligned to a net zero world is important. And the CRREM resources can help you to accomplish that. I have here, as I'm based in Germany, a tiny little example of what you should not do. You should not do nothing. And if you do nothing, you can see here that sort of the starting point, in this case, 54 kilogram CO2 emissions per square meter and year, and 201 kilowatt hour per square meter and year is sort of the current situation of the office property stock in Germany. We suggest to reduce that until 2030 to this figure here, the green one, 109 kilowatt hour per square meter and year. And in this case, we would not expect any impacts on having significantly higher energy consumption compared to what the market would expect. And we would not expect any kind of CO2 taxation. If you don't do anything, if you remain on this sort of average level of today, and if you have a property that has a fairly low net rent, as you can see here, 13 euros per square meter, you would expect an additional 8 to 10% impact on your net rent, which means the net rent would be reduced by this amount because clearly tenants in your office properties would look at their overall expenses, which means operating expenses and energy, including, of course, the net rent they are paying. And if you don't do anything, you would see a situation where they face additional energy costs, they would face additional CO2 taxation costs, And that would put, of course, a lot of pressure on your net rent. In our case here, we suggest that it might be reduced by 8 to 10%, which is, of course, a significant amount. And you could do this kind of example in all countries. And this is a clear call to work on your transition risk, make sure you're aligned to what's yet to come related to the regulation, and a clear call to work on decarbonization. What we suggest is look at energy efficiency first, work on the insulation, work on the technical equipment, make sure you exit all fossil fuel combustion on site, so no fossil fuel combustion related directly to your property boundaries on your property. Then, of course, increase renewable energy production on site, work on consumer behavior, look at smart metering to make sure you also control what you want to achieve. And the last step, maybe for some, this is interesting because some market participants start with this step, but we think the last ultimate steps should be, if you worked on all other 4 steps before, to procure green energy, to procure green electricity. Of course, we are in favor of procuring green electricity from the public grid or from the grid, but we would think that this is the last step and should not be the first step in terms of a net zero strategy. You see here that our CRREM pathways are not just included in the freeware Excel tool that is available on the website, but a lot of very prominent IT benchmarking providers, target setters, consultancies are including the CRREM pathways in their offerings. So if you use any of these resources, you will also see sort of the CRREM benchmark in these resources. Thank you very much for your attention.